Hello everybody, I'm Joss Hackforth-Jones, the Director of Sothebys Institute of Art London, and it's my enormous pleasure to welcome you all to Sothebys Institute of Art. We're sitting in one of our beautiful first floor rooms looking out onto Bedford Square, but it's my enormous pleasure to welcome Frances Christie, who is our graduation speaker for this year, and Frances will be speaking to our students on May the 11th. Frances is Senior Director and Head of Modern and Post-War British Art. So I'd love to start, Frances, by asking you about your own career trajectory and how you launched yourself into the art world. I know that you took your first degree at the University of Cambridge, and then you did an MA in Modern Art at the Courtauld Institute of Art. But I'd love to hear more about what you did with that initial training.
I have to say, when I was at university, I hadn't a clue, really, which part of the art world I wanted to go into. And it's amazing here at the Institute, because obviously you give everyone a much clearer idea of what there is out there to be gainfully employed. When I was at Cambridge, I mean, when I told the careers advisor that I maybe wanted to go into the arts, she sort of looked at me blankly. Anyway, luckily, I was accepted on an internship at Sothebys, and I literally wrote a very open letter. I live in Scotland, so I wrote to the Edinburgh office and said, could I come and do an internship? And I am forever grateful to whichever amazing person in the Edinburgh office actually opened my letter and wrote back to me and said that they didn't do internships in Edinburgh because they were a tiny office, and having been there I now know, but that she would send my CV to Sotheby's in London. And so, sure enough, I then got an email from the Human Resources Department at Sotheby's in London, and they said that all the sort of main departments were full, but they did have a slot in the catalogue production department. And I thought, well, amazing. I mean, I have no idea which departments there are. And so I spent a summer, it was in between first and second year of university, in the deepest, darkest basement opposite the main Sotheby's on Bond Street in catalogue production. And even in this department where you really are, you're not surrounded by the fine arts, you're not surrounded by objects of art. I was helping to file old catalogues, but I loved it. The person in charge of me sort of said to me, well, we've got loads of spare catalogues, take whichever ones you want. And so I was like a kid in a toy shop, and I knew exactly then, even in catalogue production, which is not something that I'd ever thought I'd want to go into, I knew that I really wanted to be an auction house because I loved the change, the fast pace, the buzz. And so after that internship at Sotheby's, I then applied to all the other auction houses for all my other university summers afterwards to do internships. And then luckily, when I finished my MA, Sotheby's were the only auction house at the time that offered the graduate training scheme. So I did that. I did the Sotheby's graduate training scheme, and whilst I was on the scheme, a job came up at Sotheby's Olympia, and I've been at Sotheby's ever since.
Gosh, yes, and you've been there quite a long time, and you're now Senior Director, and you have amazing responsibilities, and you're also an auctioneer, and you're also on the Antiques Roadshows. So tell me about women in leadership, because that's not only is this, a topic that is very public and has a lot of scrutiny at the moment, but of course here at the Institute, the majority of our students, about 85% of our students are women, and what we want to do is propel both our male and our female students into the art world. We talk about preparing them for a career. We talk about enabling them to launch themselves into the art world. But many of our students also have aspirations to leadership positions in the art world. So tell me a little bit about that. What are your perceptions now that you are a woman leader alongside some amazing women at Sotheby's?
I think we've always been really lucky at Sotheby's in that ever since I joined, and that was in 2002, there have always been incredible women in very senior positions. Until fairly recently, and since 2002, the heads of the two biggest departments at Sotheby's in London were women. and they were Shane Westphal, who was head of Contemporary, and Melanie Claw, who was head of Impressionist. And Helena Newman is now head of Impressionist, and she is also a Sotheby's chairman. And I think that's hugely admirable. And because of their example, at Sotheby's, there's always been a very natural progression for women. And I've never felt that there was a sort of male-female thing, which I think is really positive and really encouraging. So I would say to everyone in the art world that anything's possible. And I think it's amazing here at the Institute that you're aware of that. As I say, I compare it to my own experience at university, and everyone just looked slightly blank when you mentioned anything to do with the art market or the wider art world. So I think the students here are so lucky to have that insight, and also that you're looking out for their progression.
Well, one thing that we were talking about earlier also was women as auctioneers, because that is complex, it's demanding, it's about having reading a room, having that kind of intellectual and emotional intelligence. It's about being on top of your client base. It's about looking at the bank of telephones. It's about working closely with the clerk to make sure that you're reading the room, that the bids are right. And one of, just to your point earlier about, which I'd love to draw you out on in terms of how does anyone know that they want to be part of an auction house? And one of the I think, amazing training activities that happens here is that twice a year for our semester courses, the entire bids department from Sotheby's decamps, in fact, to this room and trains our students in auctioneering. So we have a podium set up. We have, last time it was one of our own alumni who stood at the podium and showed our student how to sweep the room with her hand to make sure you don't miss anyone, but also to take control of the room. So I want to come back and perhaps talk about women in those very demanding roles and how we encourage them to have that kind of confidence.
I suppose the first thing I'd say is the biggest step is actually going to a live auction. I think lots of people don't realise that you can simply just walk in and experience it. And I know everyone here will have, because that's the heart of what you do. And I think, again, that's incredible, because I think once you've soaked up that energy and the excitement of an auction, it's addictive. You can see why collectors come back again and again to bid, because they want to be part of that excitement. Taking an auction, I love it. I absolutely love it. However, the first time, and actually subsequent times, it's sort of equal part exhilarating as it is terrifying. But I think I've learned a lot from it. And I think the simplest bit I've learned about the control, as our amazing head of bids sort of said to me, is no one else in the room knows what's going on. You are literally the only person who actually knows about the numbers and how to control it. And if you don't speak, no one else will speak. And they don't know what the numbers are either. And I think knowing that incredible bit of information, I'm the only one that knows, you suddenly are empowered. And I think it's the same that we always say to everyone, that actually knowledge is power. Confidence in your knowledge and your ability, I think, gives people confidence to do anything. And I often say to friends and colleagues that when they're feeling a bit nervous about talking about pictures or talking about something that we're working on, that more often than not, we know more than anyone else in that room.
Exactly.
And I think that gives people confidence. And I think it's the same in auctioneering. And so hopefully, as we go forward, I mean, I suppose that is one side of Sotheby's where traditionally, for whatever reason, there are more male auctioneers than female auctioneers. But now, you know, Helena Newman, our current chairman,
amazing auctioneer.
She is incredible.
Spectacular.
And she takes all the Impressionist evening sales, and she's really led the way. There are many more women coming up through the ranks. I think it's getting over that first hurdle. I really wish I'd done one of your courses, because until I did auctioneer training, I had absolutely no idea that there were set increments, that reserves were usually at fairly consistent levels. And it made me realise that for years and years, I've been setting the most annoying reserves for auctioneers to hit. And now I'm obviously much more on it. I love it, but I can also appreciate that it's not for everyone, either male or female. It does take...
hugely demanding.
Or rather, I'd say you've just got to control the nerves.
Right.
Because it can be really nerve-wracking. But I always come back to the fact that when you stand up, you're the only one that can say anything.
Yes.
No one else knows,
Yes.
so...
Well, that brings us to auctions, and you've been responsible for some amazing star auctions. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. I guess the ones that come immediately to mind are the David Bowie, Howard Hodgkin earlier this year. No, late last year, wasn't it? And I know you have another Howard Hodgkin coming up. But again, what also interests me about these two sales, where we're talking about artists who are also collectors, is that there was this really, really vibrant public program of talks, of engagement with collectors, but also with art enthusiasts and also with the broader public. So there's a lot to talk about there in terms of star auctions, but also perhaps we could follow up and talk a little bit about the way in which traditional notions of the art world as being separated between the commercial and the private are breaking down. But maybe we should start with your views on those two amazing sales and what you've got coming up.
I have to say, I think these big star auctions, as you call them, they're really at the heart of everything that we do. And I think they unite all of those great points that you just made. I think first and foremost, I think people get really inspired by seeing what inspirational people that they know and admire are interested in. In the case of David Bowie, I mean, he couldn't be more internationally known. And so there were two interesting things about that. Firstly, that someone as musically talented as he was also had a lesser known side as a collector. And then beyond that as a collector, he chose to collect 20th century British art. He didn't collect Gerhard Richters and Andy Warhols. He chose to collect Henry Moore, Winifred Nicholson, William Scott, Kenneth Armitage, Patrick Caulfield. Names that are at the core of Tate Britain's collection, but perhaps aren't so well known on the west coast of America.
Yep.
So what his collection did was just multifold. It introduced to a wider world, it raised the exposure of so many of these great British artists, many of whom are only known in Britain. And secondly, because he collected without a hierarchy, he didn't mind whether it was an oil or a watercolor or a pencil drawing. I think he really inspired both top collectors and also new collectors that anything goes. As long as you're really passionate about it and you're really interested in it, it makes your collection so much more intriguing if you follow an instinct, if you follow what you like, and if you collect organically. And although they're very different people, I think the same can be said for Howard Hodgkin. He lived and worked not far from where we're sitting today, and he really is principally known as one of Britain's most vibrant painters. It was a great privilege to sell his personal collection. And colorist. I mean, color was really at the heart of what he did. Yeah. And although he said he was never an abstract painter, his paintings are very much abstracted views of people or places or of emotions. But behind that, what was so special about his own collection was that it really was a myriad of different disciplines. He had incredible Indian art, Islamic art, European sculpture, furniture, textiles, rugs. It was such a rich kind of cacophony of objects. And that was revealing in so many different ways. And I think it really made people understand where his colors came from, where his emotional relationships within the paintings came from. And we're really excited that this summer we're just about to announce that as a follow-up from that sale, we're holding an exhibition and auction just dedicated to his works on paper. And this really feeds into what you were saying.
This is hot news.
This is hot news, hot off the press, hasn't even been announced yet. It follows sort of in the footsteps of what you were saying about auctions tying into public programs. What we hope from our auctions is that people do learn something, that they are inspiring, that people discover new areas that they might never have thought of coming across before. So in the case of Howard's personal collection, I never thought I would ever, me myself, sort of bid on an Isnick tile. But because of Howard's influence, and I could suddenly see the colours, the mastery, the artisanship that were involved, I was suddenly drawn to a discipline that I'd never previously properly looked at. And that's what we really hope happens to everyone who comes through our doors. And this summer's sale is based on Howard's works on paper. And he's quite singular in that respect, in that although he's known as a painter, his works in print and his unique works on paper were very much an integral part of his process. And so, as I say, we hope that that sale will inspire both established collectors of Hodgkin's work who might not have realised that he had such an alternative body of work, but also because the price points are much lower than his paintings, it's a way for new collectors to come into a market, and a way for new people to learn something else about one of Britain's greatest artists. And through all of these great sales, actually all of our normal sales as well, we always have a programme on Sundays called Sunday at Sothebys. We have very informal gallery talks, and we usually invite either academics or a Sotheby's member of staff to give a little talk about sort of key points in the exhibitions. And I always think it's worth reminding people...
I've been to some of those talks and they're amazing, really amazing, or conversations too.
Exactly, and I think it's worth reminding people that ultimately one of the great privileges of the auction houses is that, unlike a museum, we handle these incredible museum quality works of art for a moment only. And it's really a chance, not just for collectors, but for any art enthusiast, anyone who's interested in the arts, to come in and experience these objects and paintings before they disappear again. And I'd say from a learning point of view, that's really crucial, because you can learn so much more about pictures, objects, furniture in an auction house, because you can ask a specialist to help you touch it, to look at the back, to pick it up, which you obviously can't do in a museum. And actually one of my top tips for people in an auction house is to ask to look at the back of a picture, because I think the back
really
often
important.
says so much more than the front. And I think that's something that is amazing about the Institute students, is they have that access early on. I think when I was at university, I had no idea about how to handle a picture. And it's often one of my interview tests when I put out works of art for prospective interviewees to look at. And so many of them don't pick up the picture, or they don't have a natural instinct to explore it. And that's one of the tips, is it's looking to see what's on the back. Often, you know, we ask people to tell us what the artist should be, and often it just says on the back. So if they picked up the picture, they would see it.
All the labels are important.
All the labels
too.
are there.
Yes, no, that's absolutely fascinating. And again, what you were saying about the education side of Sotheby's is I think really important, that people shouldn't feel intimidated and feel that if they go into any auction house they have to buy something. It's also about being enthusiastic about art. It's also about getting your eye in, and most collectors who now have major collectors started in that way, because unless you see a lot, you can't develop a discerning eye. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think it's having that sense of discovery. It's having that interest. And people often say that the more you realise you don't know, the more you're compelled to learn more to know. And I also think it's quite interesting. It's like when you decide to buy a house, you don't just look at one house, you look at lots around. You might look up what last houses previously sold for. You'll do a bit of market research. I think the same's for pictures, in that if you're interested in a particular area, I always tell people, you know, go to all the exhibitions, go to galleries, go to commercial galleries as well. Have a talk to the specialist, find out what those things have or haven't sold for in the past. It's the same as, and it makes you more interested in the piece, because you find out more about it, and then it leads you down into other avenues. And I think that's why these star collections are so important, is because they invite people in, and suddenly people are inspired to follow in the footsteps of other great collectors.
Well, for the Bowie sale, it was almost impossible to move around and look at his amazing collection and talk about an amazing eye there too, because of the press of people. So that was fascinating. Now, we talked a little bit before, or you touched on an area of British art and the international interest now in British art. But one of the things I imagine that you've seen in your years at Sothebys also is the rise of engagement with contemporary art, which is just become, is such a major sector. And I wondered if you could talk about that and the intersection between that and the area you're responsible for, just because we're running out of time now too.
I think modern and post-war British art, we're incredibly lucky in that we've sort of ridden the wave with the contemporary art department in terms of growth of interest in both of our areas. When I first started at Sothebys, the contemporary department, it was big, but it was nowhere near as big as the Impressionist department. Whereas now, in 2018, it's the biggest department at Sotheby's in London. And I think this fits into so many wider reasons. I think something like Tate Modern, for example, the way that they curated that, the way they opened it up, I think that really democratized the art world.
Yep.
And it meant that anyone coming through London, just as they go through the British Museum, everyone goes to Tate Modern. And so suddenly it's a natural, accessible thing to do, to go and look at modern and contemporary art in a way that I think was arguably more intimidating before somewhere like Tate Modern, which was so open and accessible. And in the same way, if you look at the furniture market, Georgian furniture is, for some reason, completely out of fashion. But with the rise of the Conran shop, Habitat, Heels, that kind of look, people's lifestyle is so much more contemporary. And when you tie that together with this more open accessibility to the art world, you can see why the demand for contemporary art has just risen from strength to strength. And as I say, as a 20th century British art department, we've been lucky enough to ride the wave. And with the sort of Cool Britannia movement of the 90s, that hasn't really gone away.
No.
There's always this strong interest, luckily for us, in things that are British. The 2012 Olympic Games, I mean, the atmosphere here was incredible.
It was,
and I think that really lends itself to other parts of the arts. People are completely always interested in what's happening in London. And you look at British artists, not just visual artists, but performing artists, writers, musicians, and they are all around the world. And there is something about their Britishness that unites them.
Thank you, Frances. On that note of Cool Britannia, the contemporary, and the excitement of modern and contemporary and post-war British art, we really look forward to welcoming you back on the 11th of May. But thank you for this exciting snapshot into what you do and what animates you and excites you about your everyday career. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joss.